There is a place on this earth that you are not allowed to go. Not in the sense that there is a wall or a guard or a fence with a sign. Nothing that obvious, nothing that honest. You are simply, practically, functionally prevented from going there by a web of logistics and permissions and international agreements so thoroughly normalized that most people have never once stopped to ask why the web exists at all. The place is Antarctica, and the agreement is the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, ratified by more than 50 nations, and maintained without serious challenge or public debate for more than 6 decades. 50 nations. Think about that number for a moment. Not 2, not 5, not a coalition of allies who already agreed on everything else. 50 nations, many of them active rivals, some of them ideological enemies, all of them in the middle of a Cold War that defined the entire second half of the 20th century as a period of relentless, grinding, civilizational disagreement. These were nations that could not agree on borders, on currencies, on the correct name for a sea, on whether a particular stretch of mountains belonged to one people or another. These were nations that spent 40 years pointing nuclear weapons at each other's cities. And yet here, about this one place, they agreed, completely, unanimously, quietly, without apparent controversy, without any of the prolonged institutional friction that accompanies every other major international agreement in recorded history. The Antarctic Treaty passed as if it had already been decided somewhere else, by someone else, and the signing was simply the ceremony. That's where I had to start asking questions. Because here is what that treaty actually does, underneath the language about scientific cooperation and environmental preservation. It prohibits independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior. Not in those words exactly, but in practice, unmistakably. You need logistical support that only governments and large institutions can provide. You need permissions that are quietly, persistently difficult to obtain for anything outside approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that simply does not exist for any traveler operating outside the system. The result is that Antarctica is the one landmass on this planet that a motivated, resourced, determined individual cannot simply go and look at. Every other place, every desert, every jungle, every mountain range, every remote island in any ocean can be reached by a person with enough will and enough money. People climb the highest peaks recreationally. People cross the most hostile terrain alone. People sail to coordinates that don't appear on tourist maps. But Antarctica has a treaty, and 50 nations signed it in the same decade that sonar technology first gave humanity the ability to see what was under the ice. I want you to hold that timing in your mind, because we are going to return to it. Before we go further, I need to lay some foundation because what follows only carries its full weight if you understand what came before it. In a previous investigation in this series, I explored the event that mainstream history calls the year without a summer, 1816, the year following the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. According to the official record, a single volcano ejected enough material into the atmosphere to lower global temperatures, collapse harvests across the northern hemisphere, kill livestock, and turn summer into literal winter from New England to northern Europe. The explanation is tidy, the timeline is clean. But the deeper I went into the actual record of that period, the more the tidy explanation began to crack. Because the disruption wasn't regional, it wasn't clustered near Indonesia, it was everywhere at once, simultaneous, global, sweeping in a way that a single volcanic event, however catastrophic, does not adequately explain. And it wasn't just environmental. The years immediately surrounding 1816 saw a cascade of institutional ruptures, population displacements, and what one researcher described as civilizational amnesia. Entire communities lost continuity with what had come before them. The records thin out, not in the way records thin out during gradual decline, but in the way records thin out when something is removed. In that investigation, I proposed something that I know made some of you uncomfortable. I proposed that 1816 may not have been only a volcanic event, that its atmospheric signature bore hallmarks of something more total, more catastrophic, closer to what we would today recognize as the aftermath of civilization-ending destruction, a reset, the terminal convulsion of something large and connected and sophisticated that had existed before the 19th century, and then, around that period, was simply gone. That something, provisionally, carefully, with full awareness of how inadequate the word is, I've been calling Tartaria not an empire with clean borders on a modern map, not a country in the conventional sense, a presence, a civilization whose fingerprints appear in the architectural record, in canal systems, in city grids that emerge fully formed in the historical record without construction phases, without scaffolding periods, without any of the incremental messy archaeology that should accompany human settlement from scratch, buildings that appear complete, infrastructure that precedes the populations officially credited with building it, a pattern that repeats not in one region, not on one continent, but globally, consistently, in a way that coincidence cannot hold. That investigation ended on an open question, because that's where the evidence led. And one detail kept surfacing that I wasn't ready to address directly. One date that seemed almost too precisely placed. The year Antarctica was officially discovered, 1820. 4 years after the sky went dark. I want to talk about what that gap means. Not a generation, not a century. 4 years. 4 years after what may have been the most significant atmospheric catastrophe in recorded human history. An event that, if my previous analysis carries any weight, may have functioned as the final chapter of a global civilization's collapse. The world's most remote and most sealed and most inaccessible landmass is suddenly, officially, formally entered into the historical record, discovered, named, claimed, and not by one expedition. That's the part that doesn't get examined closely enough. Not one crew, not one nation acting alone, but three, a British crew, an American crew, a Russian crew, all operating independently, all in the same region, all within months of each other. 3 rival naval powers in 1820, without satellites, without radio, without any means of coordinating at a distance, all arriving simultaneously at the same undiscovered continent at the bottom of the world. The official explanation is competition, the natural overlap of exploration, different expeditions chasing the same prize at the same historical moment. And maybe that's true, maybe it's coincidence. But I want to ask a different kind of question, not whether it happened, whether it makes sense. Because here is what that explanation requires you to accept. That 3 separate governments, operating in different hemispheres, planning voyages to the most hostile and least documented waters on Earth, all independently arrived at the same destination within the same narrow window of time through nothing more than simultaneous curiosity, after millennia of human civilization. After the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and the Arabs and the Vikings and every sophisticated maritime culture that ever built a ship and pointed it at open water. After all of that, the largest landmass south of the equator remained entirely undiscovered, undocumented, and unnamed until 4 years after the world's sky went dark, and then 3 nations found it at once. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm saying that's a remarkable number of coincidences stacked in a very small space. And the deeper I went into the cartographic record, the more the 1820 discovery date began to look less like a beginning and more like a formality. Less like the moment something was found, and more like the moment someone decided it was time to officially acknowledge what had already been known. Here is where the evidence becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. There are maps, surviving, historically documented, academically acknowledged maps that show Antarctica long before 1820. The Piri Reis map, dated 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who stated explicitly in his own notes that he was compiling it from older source maps whose origins he did not specify, shows a southern landmass with a detailed and accurate coastline. Not a vague speculative blob pushed to the edge of the page by a cartographer filling in empty space. A charted coastline. And when researchers in the 20th century overlaid it against modern satellite imaging of the subglacial terrain, the actual rock surface beneath 2 miles of ice, the correspondence was precise enough to generate genuine academic debate that has never been satisfactorily resolved. The Orontes Phineas map from 1531 goes further. It depicts Antarctica without ice, with river systems, with mountain ranges, with internal geographic features that humanity did not technologically confirm existed until the middle of the 20th century, using sonar equipment that wouldn't be invented for another 400 years after that map was drawn. I want to say that plainly because it is easy to read past it. A map drawn in 1531 shows geographic features of Antarctica that we only confirmed using mid-century sonar technology. The official academic response to this has historically been coincidence, lucky extrapolation, the suggestion that ancient cartographers simply guessed at a southern landmass for reasons of philosophical symmetry, the idea that the north must be balanced by the south. And maybe that's true. Maybe it is coincidence. But I want you to answer a simple question for yourself. How do you guess a river? How do you extrapolate, from philosophical symmetry, the location of a specific mountain range? How do you sketch a coastline with enough accuracy that it survives comparison to satellite data 5 centuries after you drew it? You don't guess that. You don't theorize that. You map it from observation, from presence, from knowledge that was either firsthand or inherited from someone who was there. And that raises the question that the mainstream record has never answered. Who was there? Who held that knowledge? What chain of hands carried those maps from whoever first drew them, from whatever moment they were first observed and recorded, forward through time to an Ottoman admiral in 1513 who knew enough to copy them, but apparently not enough, or not willing enough, to name his sources? The admiral himself tells us the maps came from somewhere older. He does not tell us where. And the somewhere older is exactly the period we've been circling in this entire investigation. The period before 1816, the period of whatever it was that ended. Now, I want to talk about what came after, because this story doesn't stop at 1820 and it doesn't stop at 1959, and the trail doesn't grow cold. It gets warmer and more disturbing the further forward you follow it. In 1938, 7 years before the end of the Second World War, Nazi Germany launched an Antarctic expedition called the Schwabenland Operation. They mapped nearly 600,000 square kilometers of territory. They dropped thousands of marker stakes to assert territorial claims. They returned with something that, by the available documentary record, shifted internal priorities at the highest levels of the regime. What exactly? The records are incomplete in the specific way that records tend to be when the answer would matter most. What we do know is that certain senior figures in the Nazi scientific apparatus had a documented, acknowledged, publicly recorded obsession with ancient knowledge, with lost civilizations, with prehistory, with cartographic traditions that supposedly predated the modern world. These were not fringe interests. These were institutionally funded research priorities. And the Schwabenland expedition was not a minor footnote. It was a full military and scientific operation, sent to the most remote corner of the Earth at considerable expense and logistical complexity in the middle of a period when Germany was mobilizing for global war. Why? What were they looking for that was worth that investment? The silence in the record is deafening. Then, 1946, 1 year after the war ends, the United States Navy launches Operation High Jump. Not a research team, not a small exploratory vessel. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel, led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific research, mapping, and establishing a base. And maybe that's all it was. But here is the timing again, sitting in the same place it always sits when you look closely enough. A full military expedition to Antarctica, 1 year after the end of a war, in the same decade, that sonar technology would first allow humanity to see beneath the ice in detail. In the same decade, 13 years later, that 50 nations would sign an unprecedented unanimous treaty locking the continent down. The same thread, the maps, the knowledge, the carefully preserved question of what Antarctica actually is, keeps surfacing in the hands of people who had the resources to go and look. An Ottoman admiral, a Nazi expedition, an American naval fleet, 3 independent expeditions in 1820, all apparently following the same direction. What did they find? The evidence doesn't answer that. But it doesn't dismiss the question either, and it never has. This is where I need to return to the freezing itself, because I think we have been looking at Antarctica's ice from the wrong angle entirely. The standard geological account tells us that Antarctica's ice sheet formed over millions of years, a gradual accumulation driven by plate tectonics and orbital cycles and atmospheric changes, on timescales so vast they have nothing to do with human history. And perhaps that account is correct, but here is what it cannot explain. The ice-free maps. If the ice formed over millions of years, the continent was not ice-free in any period relevant to human civilization. There were no humans alive to observe and draw it. There were no cartographers copying from sources that preserved its coastline. But the maps exist. The Piri Reis map exists. The Orontius Phineus map exists. And their accuracy, their correspondence to subglacial terrain that we only confirmed centuries later, is not a thing you explain by saying the ice formed millions of years ago. Either those maps are fraudulent in a way no one has demonstrated, or Antarctica was accessible, observable, and in some form habitable within historical time, not ancient geological time, human time. Which brings us to 1816 again, and to the shape of an idea I find impossible to set aside. What if the glaciation we observe today, the 2 miles of ice, was not ancient? What if it was recent? What if the same atmospheric event or series of events that produced the year without a summer across the northern hemisphere also drove rapid, catastrophic glaciation at the southern pole? What if the continent that appears on 16th century maps as a landmass with rivers and coasts and internal geography was, in the decades surrounding 1816, in the process of being buried, not over millions of years, over a human lifetime? And what if what got buried under that ice wasn't just rock and river and mountain? What if the last accessible evidence of the civilization we've been calling Tartaria, its final geography, its remaining infrastructure, its records, its knowledge, the physical proof that something else was here before us, what if all of that went under 2 miles of ice in the same window of time that the civilization itself collapsed? The timing fits. The cartographic record fits. The pattern of what gets officially discovered and officially sealed and officially placed beyond reach fits. And the treaty, the unanimous, unprecedented treaty signed by 50 rival nations in the decade they first gained the technology to see beneath the ice, that fits too. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to be honest with you about what I cannot prove. I cannot prove that there are structures under the Antarctic ice sheet. I cannot prove that the glaciation was recent in the historical sense. I cannot prove that the 1959 treaty was designed to prevent discovery rather than to enable science. I cannot prove that Operation High Jump or the Schwabenland expedition found anything that isn't in the public record. The evidence I have is circumstantial, fragmented, and arranged in a pattern that the official narrative does not acknowledge and has never seriously attempted to explain. But I want to ask you something. In 2025, with ground-penetrating radar technology capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with satellite systems that can resolve detail from orbit that would have seemed miraculous 50 years ago, with the full weight of the most technologically advanced civilization in recorded history aimed at every corner of this planet, why is the subglacial topography of Antarctica still largely unmapped at high resolution? Why do the data gaps cluster in the interior? Why, after 6 decades of the treaty and billions of dollars of scientific investment, do we still not have a complete picture of what is under the ice? Not why we haven't gotten to it yet. Why the picture keeps not existing. The silence that surrounds that question is not the silence of neglect. It has a shape, and shapes that precise don't appear by accident. Here is what I keep returning to. If there was a civilization before ours, and the evidence scattered across this series suggests there was, it left things behind. It left the buildings that appear without construction records. It left the infrastructure that precedes the populations credited with building it. It left the canal systems and city grids and architectural techniques that our official history cannot account for. It left the maps, copied and recopied, passed through hands whose names we don't know, arriving finally in the collections of admirals and scholars who understood what they held well enough to preserve it, but perhaps not well enough or not safely enough to explain it. And somewhere, the civilization left something more, something that didn't get buried under sediment in a city center, something that didn't get repurposed into a courthouse or a train station, something that got buried under 2 miles of ice at the bottom of the world, sealed there by either the catastrophe that ended everything or by the people who came after and understood well, enough to know what needed to stay hidden. I don't know what it is. I want to be clear about that. I have been sitting with this investigation for months and it is not resolved. It has only deepened. The further I go into the record, the more I find not answers but architecture, the shape of something that was placed out of reach deliberately, and then surrounded with enough institutional agreement and enough official explanation and enough normalized inaccessibility that asking about it stopped feeling like a reasonable question and started feeling like the kind of thing that serious people don't ask, the kind of thing you move past, the kind of thing that doesn't merit further examination because everyone already agreed without discussion that it didn't. That agreement, quiet, structural, never formally announced, never formally explained, that agreement is itself the most interesting thing in this entire investigation. 50 nations do not agree on nothing. They agreed on this. And whatever this is, whatever is sitting under 2 miles of Antarctic ice, ringed by an international treaty, and kept at the edge of practical human reach, it was worth agreeing on. It was worth the unprecedented diplomatic effort of getting every rival and enemy and competing power in the mid-20th century to sign the same document and maintain that signature without wavering for more than 60 years. What is worth that? What knowledge, what evidence, what physical proof of something that powerful institutions across the world collectively decided the rest of us were not ready to see? What is it specifically that you and I are not allowed to go and look at? The buildings still stand elsewhere. The maps still exist in archives. The buried ground floors and the oversized doorways and the orphaned infrastructure and the city grids without origins, all of it still visible if you know where to look. But whatever is at the bottom of the world, that part of the evidence is sealed, frozen, placed in the one location on the planet where no motivated individual with a ship and a question can simply go and verify it for themselves. Not destroyed, not erased, just made unreachable. And there is something in that distinction that I find more disturbing than outright destruction. Because destruction says the truth is dangerous and must be ended. But preservation behind a wall says something different. It says the truth is being kept, that someone knows what it is, that someone decided who gets to know and who doesn't, and that somewhere, under 2 miles of ice that may be far younger than we're told, the answer to every question this investigation has raised is sitting in the dark, perfectly preserved, waiting, locked behind the unanimous agreement of 50 nations and the very particular silence of everyone who was ever in a position to say what they found when they went down and looked. What is really under 2 miles of Antarctic ice? I don't know, but someone does. And the fact that they made sure you couldn't go and find out for yourself, I think that might be the most important thing I've told you in this entire series. The investigation continues. The questions remain. And somewhere in the frozen silence at the bottom of the world, the architecture of everything we've been made to forget is waiting for someone to finally ask the right question, loudly enough that the ice starts to answer.